my pleasure to introduce to you today Professor Vandana Singhvi Patel. Professor Singhvi Patel has her PhD in International Business and Finance from the Stern School of Business at New York University in the United States. She has served on the faculty at IIM Bangalore, most recently as chair of our flagship PGP program in management. She will be talking to you today about macroeconomic considerations and how they might impact your investment decisions. Welcome, Vandana.
Thank you, Badri. A common process for making investment decisions is to take a top-down approach. This means first getting a sense of the macroeconomic condition of the economy, then drilling down to the sector level, and finally to identifying firms in those sectors that offer investment potential. Another is to do bottoms up, which is to start with the companies first, move up to the sector, and then to the economy. Whichever your preference, a basic look at the macroeconomic condition is a necessary input, and that is what this topic provides. GDP and its components. The starting point is, of course, GDP or gross domestic product, which is the total output of goods and services generated by the economy. Think of it this way. When you examine a person's health, you take his temperature, you measure his pulse rate, and check his blood pressure. Similarly, if you want to see how an economy is performing, is it growing, is it stagnant, or is it in decline, we would want to identify basic parameters as well. How much is the economy producing in terms of goods and services, GDP? How many people have contributed to this production? Us pessimistic economists call it the unemployment rate. And at what prices are these goods and services being sold? The inflation rate. Figure 1 below shows the growth of India's GDP over the last 4 decades under various governments. This growth was slow post-independence until the 1990s. You may have heard disparaging comments about a Hindu rate of growth. Post-liberalization, that growth has accelerated significantly, as the chart shows you. Surely you've heard recent talks in the media of how to achieve a $5 trillion economy. While this growth is impressive, you should understand that it varies substantially across different states in the Union. In Figure 2, you can see that the GSDP, the Gross State Domestic Product for the fiscal year 2018, its growth rate varies across states, with Bihar reporting the highest at 11% and Jharkhand the lowest at 4.6% per annum. You may recognize that the size of this GDP number also reflects the contribution of different economic participants to it. Household consumption, durable goods, scooters, cars, washing machines, computers, rents account for about 60% of India's GDP. Investments in things like plant, machinery, capital equipment purchases, construction of roads, railways, schools, offices, hospitals, private residential dwellings, and commercial and industrial building is about 30% of GDP. Even these numbers have varied considerably since independence. The cyclical nature of economies. Although this GDP number has grown steadily over the last several decades, it is also important to understand that economic activity ebbs and flows in what is known as a business cycle. The duration of these cycles varies. In its early years, the Indian economy was more agriculture-oriented, and the risks to the economy were largely because of events that affected agriculture, such as the monsoons. The Indian economy has become more service-oriented, as Figure 3 shows you. The changing share of GDP arising from agriculture, manufacturing, and service activity since independence is reflected in it. As you can see, service sector contributions to GDP have increased from 30% to nearly 60% since independence, while agriculture has declined from 50% to just under 20%. As the nature of the economy has shifted from agriculture to services, the volatility of economic output, as measured by GDP, has somewhat become muted. Policy making. Central banks and governments are always tinkering with economic activity to achieve macroeconomic goals. The central bank's efforts in this direction takes the form of monetary policy, which affects interest rates. Think of interest rates as a cost of money, and if these costs could come down, it could motivate some businesses to borrow money to invest in new factories. The Reserve Bank of India manages the quantity of money circulating in the economy. The tools available to them are described more fully in the deep dives associated with this topic. When the government acts to influence economic growth, it takes the form of fiscal policy. One manifestation is to adjust direct and indirect tax rates. Another way is for governments to spend on various programs. For both types of policy, the goal is to smoothen the economic cycle, though there have been times in history when this has not been the case. Both these policies can be viewed as demand side in that they are attempts to push the economy towards achieving full employment. There are also supply side policies that devise incentive schemes to encourage growth by directly addressing the economy's productive capacity. Generally speaking, policy initiatives by central bankers amount to a balancing act between managing growth and inflation, unemployment and interest rates. In recent years, policymakers have targets for growth, unemployment and inflation rate. In earlier topics, we have spoken about inflation, simply too much money chasing too few goods. If economies are viewed as growing too fast, causing above target inflation, the central bankers put on the brakes and slow down the economy by increasing interest rates. If economies are viewed as growing too slowly or not at all, then the reverse happens. This presentation gives you an introduction to how policymakers attempt to stabilize economic activity. As with financial instruments that we have discussed, we are never going to be able to predict timings of exact peaks and troughs. They are a process after all, and our purpose at PI is to inform you about the impact of these events on your investment decisions. Come back for more.